The different forms of conflict management differ on several dimensions. For example, forms of management are distinguished according to their degree of aggressiveness. War is an aggressive mode compared to negotiation. Another way of distinguishing between the different modes of conflict management is by looking at the involvement of third parties in the conflict and in the management of this conflict. Indeed, individuals involved in a conflict can choose either to try to resolve their conflict by themselves or to opt for the intervention of a third party. In this video, we will distinguish the most commonly used conflict management methods. However, note that other modes, other methods, more hybrid, for example, do exist, such as management modes that combined the use of mediation and arbitration in succession. Let us also note that the analysis of these modes is based on Western societies. Other modes exist in other parts of the world. I thus invite the learners registered in this MOOC to share these other modes of conflict management in the discussion thread available after this video. As I have just said, one way of distinguishing between the various modes of conflict management is considering the degree of involvement or intervention of third parties. If we put aside the very aggressive forms of conflict management, such as war or combat, negotiation is the mode of conflict management in which the degree of involvement of a third party is zero. Indeed, in negotiations, the parties involved in the conflict try to manage their conflict together through a discussion. This discussion can either take on a fairly competitive character, which is what we call distributive negotiation, or a more cooperative character, and this is what we call integrative negotiation. Negotiation, as a way of managing divergences, is extensively described in the second course of this certificate. Sometimes the parties involved in a conflict are accompanied by their counselor during their discussion. This is the case, for instance, if the negotiation is held in the presence of the parties' respective lawyers. The presence of the counselors can be justified for several reasons, in particular when the counselor has specific expertise that the parties lack, such as the legal expertise. The involvement of a counselor can be considered a method of conflict management that involves a third party. It should be noted, however, that in this case, the third party is not independent of the parties in conflict, since each counselor undertakes to defend the interest of the party he or she represents to the best of his or her ability. This non-independence of the third party is not without consequences. Remember, for instance, the bias of excessive optimism that affects both the parties involved in the conflict and the counselors representing them. Let's now focus on conflict management methods that involve a neutral and independent third party. We will distinguish 4 of them: mediation, conciliation, arbitration, and courts. What distinguishes these 4 modes is the degree of involvement of the third party in the final decision-making. For example, in mediation, the third party accompanies the parties in their discussion process and tries as much as possible to promote the development of cooperative rather than competitive discussions. But in theory, mediators never intervene in the substance of the problem, and they do not give their opinion as to the solutions they would recommend. In mediation, the parties remain solely responsible for the solution they decide to adopt. it is exactly the opposite that happens in a court of law. In court, the parties delegate the responsibility of the decision to the third party, the judge. Judges decide, and the decision they make is binding on the party, whether they like it or not. In between mediation and the court, we find two other modes of management. First, conciliation, which is a management method close to mediation, in that it requires the active participation of the parties in the solution-finding process. Unlike mediation, however, in conciliation, the third party is involved in the final solution, since it has been tasked with suggesting a solution to the parties in conflict. Finally, the last mode, arbitration, is a practice close to the courts, since in arbitration, the third party's solution is imposed and is binding rather than merely suggested. The difference between the court and the arbitration is that in arbitration, the parties have some leeway in the selection of the arbitrator or the arbitration organism, which is obviously not the case when the parties use the judicial procedure. In this certificate, we will only elaborate a little on conciliation and not at all on arbitration and court proceedings. In contrast, Course 3 of the certificate details in depth the mediation process.